What if the very thing you've spent your entire life searching for was never meant to be found? What if purpose, this shining, distant goal we chase with trembling hands, was nothing more than a story carved into our minds by a world terrified of uncertainty? I sometimes sit with this question and feel reality itself shift under my feet, because the moment I realized that the universe wasn't asking me to find a fixed direction, but to surrender to its mystery, something inside me cracked open. And from that crack, an entirely new way of being began to bloom. I remember the first time I truly felt the fragility of the idea of a fixed purpose. I was sitting alone, overwhelmed by a world that insisted I choose, decide, define. A world that shouted, know who you are, know where you're going, secure your destiny. But the more I tried to choose a single direction, the more suffocated I became. It was as if I was trying to trap a living, breathing mystery inside a tiny glass jar. I felt the pressure of expectations, societies, my family's, my own minds, closing in on me like walls of steel, and yet beneath that pressure something whispered, what if you stopped searching for certainty and started listening to the unknown? That whisper terrified me. The unknown is everything we're trained to avoid. We're told that chaos is dangerous, that ambiguity is failure, that if we don't define ourselves quickly, life will swallow us whole. But the more I resisted uncertainty, the more lost I felt. And one day, sitting with that internal tension stretching me thin, something in me snapped, not in despair, but in awakening. I realized that the chaos wasn't my enemy, it was the source, the very engine through which life reveals itself. I began to see that purpose wasn't hiding from me. I was hiding from purpose. Because purpose wasn't a destination, it wasn't a checklist. It wasn't a title or a career or a perfectly sculpted identity. Purpose was movement. Purpose was participation. Purpose was the way I allowed myself to engage with the unfolding miracle of existence. And the moment I opened myself to that, I felt like I'd broken free from a psychological prison I never even knew I was in. When I speak of this now, it sounds almost obvious. But at the time, it was a revelation that shook me to the core. I'd spent years trying to force myself into a path that felt stable, respectable, predictable. Yet every time I tried to anchor myself to a rigid plan, life would pull me in another direction. It was as if the universe was laughing at my tiny blueprints, whispering, you are meant for something far more fluid than this. And the more I lived, the more I saw how everything around me was always changing. Every tree, every cloud, every consciousness, every particle of dust drifting through a beam of sunlight, nothing was fixed. Reality itself was a river, not a statue. And here I was trying to freeze it, trying to freeze myself, trying to freeze meaning. And that was when it hit me my purpose couldn't be fixed because I wasn't fixed. I was an unfolding process, an evolving question, a piece of cosmic art that was continuously rearranging itself. The moment I embraced that, my life started to feel more real, almost frighteningly real. Suddenly, every moment demanded my awareness, my curiosity, my willingness to participate. I wasn't waiting for purpose to appear at the end of some long, perfectly planned road. I was meeting it moment by moment in the breathless dance of uncertainty. You see, we cling to rigid plans because we fear collapse. We fear making the wrong choice. We fear drifting. But I began to realize that the real danger wasn't drifting. It was refusing to move. The more I tried to secure my identity, the more brittle it became. But when I let my identity breathe, expand, question itself, I started to feel alive in a way I never had before. I remember walking through the world after this insight struck me, and everything felt different. The sky wasn't just the sky, it was a vast swirling canvas of infinite possibility. Every stranger passing by wasn't just a face, they were an expression of an intelligence far deeper than anything I could comprehend. Even the problems in my life changed shape. Instead of being threats to my stability, they became invitations. They were opportunities to grow, to reshape myself, to redefine what meaning meant to me. But breaking out of the illusion of fixed purpose wasn't easy. My mind fought back. It wanted certainty. It wanted guarantees. It wanted the safety of a story that had already been written. And yet, each time I slipped back into that old pattern, I felt a subtle suffocation, the kind that only happens when you're trying to shrink yourself to fit inside a narrative too small for your soul. I started questioning everything. Why was I so desperate for clarity? Why was I terrified of getting it wrong? Why did I believe that meaning had to be discovered once and then preserved forever? Who taught me that? Where did that idea come from? When I peeled back the layers, I realized it came from a culture terrified of the unknown. A culture obsessed with certainty, productivity, identity, efficiency. A culture that measures worth through destinations, not journeys. A culture that sees curiosity not as a virtue, but as a distraction. But here's the strange thing. Every time I surrendered to the unknown, my life opened. Not in chaos, but in creativity. Not in fear, but in wonder. When I stopped demanding that life hand me a purpose carved in stone, life began to reveal itself as a living conversation. And I learned to listen, not with the mind, but with the entire field of my being. I started engaging with existence differently. Instead of trying to control my path, I let my path emerge through me. Instead of trying to predict the future, I learned to respond to the present. Instead of trying to become something final, I allowed myself to be in continuous becoming. And this changed everything. Suddenly the world felt like a labyrinth, not one designed to trap me, but one designed to transform me. I felt as if I was walking alongside the edges of the mystery, touching its veil, sensing its depth, letting its uncertainty nourish me. My purpose was no longer a single direction. It was a living ecosystem, a constellation of curiosities, experiences, insights, challenges, and revelations constantly rearranging themselves as I grew. It was strange, yes. Unpredictable, yes. Sometimes terrifying, yes. But it was real. And that reality became the greatest source of meaning I had ever known. I began to feel as though the universe wasn't something I lived in, but something I lived with. A partner, not a machine, a mystery, not a map, a story, not an equation. Every day became a chance to redefine myself, not out of confusion, but out of participation, out of willingness, out of curiosity. I wasn't searching for purpose anymore. I was creating it, sculpting it, breathing it into existence through the simple act of being awake to the mystery surrounding me. And once that shift happened, I knew I could never go back. I knew I could never go back, because once I allowed myself to step into that living mystery, something inside me fundamentally shifted. It wasn't a moment of enlightenment or a sudden burst of clarity. It was more like a subtle reorientation of my inner compass, a quiet turning toward a deeper rhythm that had always been there, but had been drowned out by the noise of expectations. I began to sense that my life was not meant to be a straight line, clean and predictable, but an unfolding spiral, pulling me into layers of myself I never would have discovered had I forced everything into a fixed narrative. As I moved through my days, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward experiences that expanded my awareness rather than confined it. I realized that purpose wasn't something to be extracted from life like a mineral hiding beneath the surface. It was something that emerged through my participation, something that grew and changed with every breath, every decision, every moment of honest presence. The more I lived this way, the more I felt a kind of inner spaciousness I had never known before. It was as though the walls that once enclosed my identity had dissolved, leaving me open to the world in a way that was both grounding and exhilarating. This openness brought with it a heightened sensitivity. I noticed things that I had ignored for years, the subtle shift in the air before a storm, the unspoken emotional resonance in the eyes of a stranger, the quiet intelligence hidden in the simplest moments. It was as if reality had been speaking to me all along, whispering through patterns and sensations, but I had been too consumed with chasing certainty to hear any of it. Now that I had stepped away from the mental rigidity that once defined me, the world revealed itself with a clarity that felt almost otherworldly. I found myself drawn toward experiences that challenged my assumptions. Instead of avoiding the unknown, I leaned into it. Instead of resisting change, I watched it carefully, letting it teach me in its own enigmatic way. I realized that every shift, every disruption, every unexpected turn had something essential to offer. My purpose wasn't being threatened by uncertainty, it was being sculpted by it. The more I let change move through me, the more I felt myself transform into someone more authentic, someone less dependent on external stability and more attuned to the deeper currents of existence. There were moments when this new way of being felt overwhelming. The mind craves solid ground, and I often felt myself reaching back toward old habits, old narratives, old structures that promised safety, even if that safety came at the cost of my own evolution. But every time I tried to retreat into the illusion of certainty, something inside me resisted. It wasn't rebellion, it was recognition. A recognition that the old ways no longer fit the person I was becoming. So I allowed myself to keep evolving. I followed the subtle intuitions that rose from somewhere deeper than thought. I trusted the quiet tug of my inner world, even when it led me into unfamiliar landscapes. and with each step, I felt myself becoming more fluid, more adaptable, more capable of navigating the unpredictable terrain of existence. Instead of demanding that life reveal its blueprint to me, I discovered a sense of freedom in meeting life as it unfolded in real time without trying to force it into a predetermined shape. This shift wasn't about abandoning responsibility or drifting without intention. It was about aligning myself with the natural way things move. Life doesn't unfold in straight lines. Rivers curve, storms swirl, galaxies spiral, consciousness expands through a strange dance of chaos and coherence. When I aligned myself with that rhythm, I felt my own inner world fall into a kind of harmony. Not perfect harmony, not permanent harmony, but a dynamic harmony that responded to the present moment with sensitivity and imagination. I started noticing how much energy I had wasted trying to make my life match an idea. Ideas are rigid, reality is alive, and for years I had been trying to force myself into an idea of who I should be, instead of discovering who I actually was. When I let go of that pressure, I uncovered layers of creativity, insight, and resilience that had been buried beneath my attempts to be something final. The truth was that nothing in me was final. I was constantly emerging, and when I embraced that, my entire inner landscape opened. With this opening came a deeper sense of curiosity. I found myself wanting to explore not just the world outside me, but the world within me. I began to observe my thoughts not as rigid truths, but as shifting clouds passing through a wider sky of awareness. I noticed patterns in my emotions, subtle rhythms that connected moments from different parts of my life. I saw how my fears weren't obstacles, but signposts pointing toward areas of growth. I could feel my consciousness stretching, expanding, learning to move in ways it had always resisted. Every day became a conversation between the known and the unknown inside me, and instead of trying to silence that conversation, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. This allowed me to act with greater clarity, not because I knew exactly where I was going, but because I had become more attuned to the truth of the moment. My choices became more intentional, not because they were part of a fixed plan, but because they were rooted in a deeper presence, a deeper connection to myself and the world. I began to understand purpose not as a single direction, but as a continual alignment with the deeper movement of my being. It wasn't about predicting the path. It was about maintaining an inner orientation that allowed me to navigate whatever path emerged. This orientation came from curiosity, from willingness, from openness to the unpredictable intelligence of existence. When I lived this way, even the smallest experiences carried meaning. Even the most ordinary moments became gateways to insight. As I continued living from this unfolding center, I noticed that my fear of uncertainty began to dissolve. Not disappear entirely, but soften into something manageable, something workable. Fear became a companion rather than an enemy. It reminded me that I was stepping beyond the boundaries of what I once knew, and that this stepping was essential for my growth. Instead of collapsing under the weight of the unknown, I learned to move with it, letting it stretch my perception beyond familiar limits. This transformation wasn't dramatic on the outside. To others, I may have seemed much the same. But inside, everything had shifted. My relationship with time changed. My relationship with identity changed. My relationship with meaning changed. I no longer needed to cling to a single narrative because I had discovered a deeper trust in the unfolding nature of reality. That trust became my anchor, not because it offered stability, but because it allowed me to move with life rather than against it. The more I lived this way, the more I felt a quiet confidence rising within me. Not the confidence that comes from certainty, but the confidence that comes from being fully engaged with the present moment. A confidence rooted in adaptability, in openness, in the willingness to face whatever arises with awareness rather than resistance. This confidence wasn't loud or boastful. It was steady, grounded, and deeply alive. And as I embraced this ever-evolving way of being, I realized that purpose wasn't something I needed to hunt for in the distance. It was something that emerged through the way I lived, through the way I responded to life, through the way I allowed myself to participate in the mystery of existence with honesty and curiosity. Purpose wasn't a destination. It was a relationship with myself, with reality, with the unknown that shapes every moment of my experience. This realization became the foundation of my path forward. A path not built from certainty but from awareness, from presence, from the continuous unfolding of who I am becoming. That realization became the foundation of my path forward, shaping everything I began to perceive, everything I allowed myself to feel, everything I permitted myself to explore. And as I walked further into this unfolding relationship with the unknown, I discovered that the deeper I went, the more the boundaries of who I thought I was began to dissolve. It felt as though I was stepping into a new dimension of awareness, one that had always been waiting beneath the surface of my old habits and rigid expectations. There was a strange liberation in admitting that I didn't have all the answers. I didn't need to. My life no longer depended on the illusion of control. Instead, I found myself drawn into a state of radical curiosity, where each moment became an entry point into something vast and alive. I could feel myself becoming more fluid, like water taking the shape of whatever experience I was poured into. And through that fluidity, something extraordinary began to happen. Life stopped feeling like a problem to solve and started feeling like an experience to engage with. I noticed how often people around me were still trapped inside the idea that purpose must be found captured, nailed down like a trophy on a wall. But whenever I watched them struggle with that impossible task, I recognized the shadow of my former self, the version of me that believed I needed certainty to be complete. It was almost painful to remember how fiercely I once clung to that belief. But now, standing on the other side of it, I felt nothing but gratitude for the unknown that had gently dismantled that illusion. With each passing day, my trust in the unfolding deepened. I began sensing layers of subtle intelligence moving through my life. Not dramatic revelations, but quiet, intricate patterns that seemed to link my inner experiences to the outer world. Conversations, dreams, thoughts, synchronicities, everything carried meaning when I met it with openness. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. Even the moments that appeared chaotic or confusing held a kind of quiet blueprint, guiding me toward a deeper understanding of myself. I realized that this was what it meant to live consciously, not by controlling life, but by participating in it fully. The more consciously I moved, the more I saw how purpose wasn't something that arrived all at once. It revealed itself gradually, like a piece of music unfolding note by note. And I knew that if I ever tried to rush it, force it, or freeze it into something static, I would lose the very essence of what made it meaningful. There were times when this new path pulled me into parts of myself I wasn't prepared to face. Old fears resurfaced, old insecurities echoed, old memories stirred like dust rising in a quiet room. But instead of pushing them away, I allowed myself to sit with them, to feel them, to listen to what they had been trying to tell me for years. These inner shadows were not obstacles. They were invitations, fragments of myself that had been waiting for attention, for integration, for acceptance. As I moved through these inner landscapes, I noticed how my relationship with discomfort began to change. Instead of resisting it, I treated discomfort as a teacher. Every sharp emotion, every uncertain feeling, every moment of inner friction became a doorway into a deeper layer of my own truth. I understood that if I resisted what I felt, I remained stagnant. But if I moved through it with awareness, I emerged with a broader, more expansive sense of who I could be. This expanding awareness brought with it a sense of inner strength that didn't depend on external validation or clarity. It came from knowing that I had the capacity to navigate anything, not because I had mastered life, but because I had learned to trust myself in the midst of its unpredictability. I wasn't the same person who needed everything to make sense before taking a step forward. I could move even when the path was unclear. I could breathe even when nothing was certain. I could live without needing to know what came next. And ironically, that freedom allowed me to experience a deeper form of purpose than I had ever imagined before. Purpose began to feel less like a mission and more like a state of being, a way of meeting the world with presence, curiosity, and authenticity. I didn't need a fixed direction. I needed a genuine connection to the moment in front of me. That connection became my guide, my anchor, my orientation. I found myself becoming more attentive to the subtle shifts in my internal landscape. I could sense when something aligned with my deeper being and when it didn't. I wasn't trying to fit into narratives that weren't meant for me anymore. I wasn't chasing goals that didn't resonate with my inner truth. I wasn't performing for the world's expectations. Instead, I followed the quiet inner movements that felt alive, real, resonant. This inner attunement created a sense of clarity that no rigid plan ever could. It was a clarity rooted not in certainty but in alignment. I could feel when something was right, not because I had evidence or guarantees, but because there was a deeper intelligence inside me recognizing itself in the unfolding moment. I learned to trust that recognition more than any external advice or societal blueprint. Living this way required a kind of courage I had never exercised before. It asked me to let go of the safety of predefined identities and move into the vast, open terrain of possibility. It demanded that I release the pressure to always know, always decide, always define. It challenged me to allow my life to be a process rather than a product. And through that challenge, I discovered a strength that came from vulnerability rather than certainty. I started noticing how everything in existence flowed according to its own rhythm. The seasons, the tides, the growth of trees, the evolution of stars. Nothing in nature rushes to a final identity. Everything is becoming. Everything is adjusting. Everything is discovering its next form through continuous interaction with the world around it. When I realized that I was no different from these natural processes, I felt a deep sense of belonging. I wasn't separate from life. I was an expression of it, a movement within a greater movement. This recognition dissolved the last remnants of pressure I had carried for so long. I didn't need to force myself into a final state. I didn't need to live up to an imaginary version of myself. I didn't need to chase a goal that would one day make me complete. I was already whole. Not because I was finished, but because I was unfinished. My wholeness came from my capacity to grow, to adapt, to evolve. The more I embraced this, the more life opened in unexpected ways. Opportunities appeared that I never could have predicted. Conversations unfolded that shifted the entire direction of my inner world. Moments of synchronicity emerged with such precision that it felt as though reality was participating with me, guiding me toward layers of understanding I would have missed if I had clung to a fixed path. I realized that meaning wasn't something I found in the distance. It was something that revealed itself when I opened myself fully to the present. Every moment carried a kind of quiet revelation, a subtle message, a piece of the puzzle that made the next step possible. And I understood that if I had still been chasing a rigid definition of purpose, I would have been blind to all of it. This way of living didn't make life easier. It made it deeper. It made it more vivid, more intimate, more honest. It required presence, awareness, and the humility to admit that the universe was far more complex than any story I could create about it. But in that humility, I found a freedom that no certainty could ever match. And as I continued walking this path, the path that revealed itself moment by moment, I felt myself stepping into a version of life that wasn't limited by fear or bounded by expectation. I stepped into something richer, something more expansive, something that felt like the beginning of a deeper awakening. I stepped into that awakening with a sense of quiet recognition, as if some hidden part of me had finally emerged from behind a long forgotten doorway. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden flash of cosmic revelation. It was something far more grounded, far more intimate, like the soft turning of a page inside my own being. And yet, I could feel that everything in my life had been leading me toward this moment, every shift, every uncertainty, every unresolved question, every strange detour. They had all been guiding me into this deeper understanding that my life was never meant to be a fixed story, but a living expression of something infinitely larger than anything I could name. I realized that the entire time I had been seeking clarity, seeking purpose, seeking direction. I had been searching outside myself. I had been looking for answers in structures, in expectations, in the narratives handed to me by society, by culture, by the voices that insisted life must be predictable in order to be meaningful. But now, standing inside this new awareness, I felt those old expectations dissolve like fog under morning light, and in their absence, I finally understood that meaning was not something waiting for me in the distance. It was something emerging through the way I chose to be in each moment. As I moved deeper into this realization, I noticed that the boundaries I once believed defined me were thinner than I had imagined. Identity wasn't a rigid container. It wasn't a fixed shape. It was more like a fluid field of possibilities, constantly shifting, constantly reorganizing itself based on the experiences I welcomed into my awareness. I felt as though my inner world was expanding, stretching into a dimension I had never dared to explore. And in that expansion, I discovered a sense of spaciousness that brought a profound calm into my life. There were moments when this calm felt almost surreal. For so long, I had been conditioned to measure my worth through achievement, productivity, and external validation. I had learned to treat myself like a machine that needed to perform according to some predetermined blueprint. But now, as the old layers peeled away, I felt something much more organic rising within me, a sense of being that didn't depend on perfection, certainty, or performance. It was a sense of being rooted in presence itself. This presence allowed me to see the world with new eyes. Everything around me seemed alive with meaning. The quiet hum of the evening air, the subtle flicker of light on a window, the distant murmur of people moving through their own private universes. It all carried a kind of hidden intelligence, a whisper of something that connected everything to everything else. And as I listened to these whispers, I realized that I had been living most of my life behind a veil woven from fear and expectation. Now that the veil had lifted even slightly, I could feel the true depth of existence pressing gently against my awareness. There was a strange beauty in the way ordinary moments began to glow with significance. I felt attuned to the smallest details, aware of subtle patterns I had previously ignored. It was as though life had always been speaking to me, but I had only now learned to listen. And the more I listened, the clearer it became that purpose was not a destination waiting at the end of a perfectly constructed path. It was something that revealed itself through the very act of paying attention. I realized that every moment carried its own invitation. Some moments invited stillness, others invited motion. Some asked me to let go, others asked me to step forward, and my life, my entire sense of direction, was shaped by how honestly I responded to those invitations. When I resisted them, I felt fragmented. When I met them with presence, everything aligned effortlessly. Purpose emerged naturally, without struggle, without force. This understanding reshaped my relationship with uncertainty. Instead of viewing the unknown as a threat, I began to see it as a companion. The unknown was not an enemy. It was the very space where growth happened, where transformation took root, where the deeper layers of myself came alive. I understood that if everything were predictable, life would lose its magic. It would become a stagnant repetition rather than an unfolding revelation. The unknown was the very source of that revelation. As I embraced this, I felt a deeper sense of trust building inside me. Not the naive trust that everything would always work out the way I wanted, but the trust that I could navigate whatever arose with awareness, resilience, and openness. I no longer needed to cling to the illusion of control. I no longer needed to protect myself from the natural unpredictability of life. Instead, I allowed myself to move with it, to dance with it, to flow with the currents that had always been guiding me. Every experience became part of that flow. Every joy, every challenge, every unexpected shift contributed to the evolution of my understanding. And through this evolution, I discovered that purpose was not something singular or static. It was something that grew, something that expanded as I expanded. It was something that took shape through my willingness to participate in the living mystery of existence. I began to look back on my life with a different kind of clarity. Instead of judging my past choices, I saw them as necessary pieces of my unfolding. Even the moments that had felt chaotic or painful had played a vital role in shaping who I was becoming. They had pushed me beyond the edges of my old identity, forcing me to confront the parts of myself I had long avoided. And through that confrontation, I had grown in ways I could never have predicted. It became clear to me that growth was not a straight line but a spiral, constantly returning me to familiar themes at deeper and deeper levels. Every time I thought I had learned a lesson fully, life brought me back to it with new insight, new depth, new layers of understanding. This spiral of learning was not a sign of failure. It was the rhythm of transformation. It was the natural way consciousness unfolded. With this understanding came a sense of acceptance. I accepted that I was not meant to be perfect. I was meant to be evolving. I accepted that uncertainty would always be part of my experience, because it was the doorway into new possibilities. I accepted that the mystery of life was not something to solve, but something to participate in, something to explore with curiosity rather than fear. And as this acceptance settled into my awareness, I felt a peace that was deeper than anything I had known before. It wasn't the peace of having everything figured out. It was the peace of knowing that I didn't need to. It was the peace of recognizing that my life was a dialogue between my inner world and the infinite intelligence of existence. And in that dialogue, purpose emerged naturally, effortlessly, beautifully. This peace didn't isolate me from the world. It connected me to it more deeply. I felt more compassion for others, understanding that everyone was navigating their own relationship with the unknown. I felt more present with the people around me, recognizing the quiet struggles hidden beneath the surface of their lives. I began to see that every person carried their own mystery, their own pain, their own longing for meaning. And this understanding opened my heart in a way I had never expected. The more I opened, the more I realized that connection, not achievement, not certainty, not control, was the true foundation of purpose. Connection to myself, connection to others, connection to the larger field of existence that shaped every moment of my life. This connection was not something I had to earn. It was something I had to allow. Something I had to recognize as already present, already available, already woven into the fabric of who I was. As this recognition deepened, I felt myself awaken to an even larger truth. I understood that my life was not a separate story unfolding in isolation. My life was part of a much larger movement, a movement of consciousness evolving through every experience, every insight, every moment of awareness. I was not just shaping my own purpose. I was participating in a collective unfolding far bigger than anything my mind could comprehend. This awakened something profound inside me, a sense of responsibility not rooted in pressure but in love, a responsibility to be fully present, fully aware, fully engaged with the mystery of existence, a responsibility to honor the intelligence moving through my life, to meet it with sincerity, with courage, with openness, a responsibility to live in a way that allowed purpose to express itself through me, not through force but through alignment. And with that responsibility came clarity. Not the clarity of fixed answers, but the clarity of direction rooted in authenticity. I knew that as long as I remained open, curious, and present, I would always find my way. Even when the path ahead appeared uncertain, I trusted that the next step would reveal itself when the moment was right. I trusted that the mystery would continue guiding me, as it always had, even when I was unaware of it. This trust allowed me to release the last remnants of fear that once kept me confined. I no longer feared change. I no longer feared uncertainty. I no longer feared the dissolution of old identities. Instead, I welcomed these things as essential parts of my evolution. I welcomed them as catalysts for transformation, as doorways into deeper layers of understanding. I began to see that life was always inviting me to grow, always offering me new opportunities to expand my awareness, always whispering the next step of my unfolding. And as I listened to those whispers, I felt myself stepping into a new phase of my being, not a phase defined by certainty but by presence, not a phase defined by rigid plans but by responsiveness, not a phase defined by external validation but by internal alignment. I felt myself becoming someone capable of moving through the world with a deeper sense of purpose, not because I had found an answer, but because I had found a way of being. I understood, finally, that purpose was not something I discovered once and carried forever. Purpose was something that evolved with me, something that changed shape as I changed shape, something that expanded as I expanded, something that revealed itself in layers, in moments, in experiences, in subtle shifts of awareness. And the more I embraced this evolving relationship with purpose, the more alive I felt, the more present I felt, the more connected I felt. It was as though the entire universe had opened inside me, revealing a depth I had never imagined possible. And in that depth, I discovered the true essence of what it meant to be human, not to know, not to control, not to conquer, but to participate in the sacred unfolding of existence. This participation became the guiding principle of my life. It became the foundation of how I moved, how I thought, how I felt, how I created, how I connected. It became the way I navigated every challenge, every opportunity, every moment of uncertainty. It became the source of my resilience, my courage, my clarity. And it became the root of a quiet, unshakable fulfillment that did not depend on external outcomes. I understood at last that the greatest purpose I could ever embody was to live with awareness, to live with presence, to live with curiosity, to live with openness, to let life move through me without resistance, to let the mystery reveal itself through my willingness to engage with it fully. And in that understanding, I finally felt whole, not because I had reached an end, but because I had embraced the endlessness of my own becoming.